Is the United States funding a controversial group in Ukraine? Plus, is Russia claiming control over a number of Ukrainian villages, even as Ukraine says not so fast? We have those stories and a bunch more today. It's a busy one. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so the lead story here is the U.S. has lifted a weapons ban on the Azov Brigade. Now, you might know the Azov Brigade is controversial because it's been in operation since at least 2014. But what makes it unique is that for a long time, the Azov Brigade was not a part of the Ukrainian military. They were their own independent formation. And after years of negotiation prior to the invasion, the Azov Brigade was brought into the National Guard of Ukraine, controlling what up until that point had been a pretty controversial unit. There was a lot of allegations when the unit was founded that it was founded as a Ukrainian Nazi or super far right unit. In fact, the Azov Brigade flag contains some SS iconography, but one of the things that has happened, especially since the invasion, is that the Azov Brigade has worked tirelessly to clean up its image and leave that far-right stuff in the past. And it seems like by most accounts, they've been successful. Not even so much because the Azov Brigade has cleaned up its image and removed some of its worst offenders from their formation, but simple attrition has done some of that job for them. Many of the soldiers that joined up when Azov was its own militia, they are no longer serving, oftentimes because of the high casualty rates. And the new soldiers that have been brought in are focused on the story of the Azov Brigade, its history, less about its ideology and more about its combat record, right? Remember, Azov was the defenders of Mariupol and Azovstal. The Azov Brigade was also noteworthy in that it was one of the first units to fight against the annexation of the Donbas in 2014, and was one of the first units to fight and successfully defeat Russian units at the initial invasion. So this is a unit that even the State Department, right, has said they've cleaned up their act. They investigated them quite thoroughly. They found no evidence of law of war violations or war crimes or anything else. And this is important, right? Because up until this point, Azov has been operating with only Ukrainian weapons, only Soviet-made weapon systems. And so in that way, it's hamstrung one of the best brigades in the Ukrainian military. And so again, this is something that is going to improve the outcomes, and because you can't remember, no one's really making new Soviet equipment, right? The only people making new stuff is the West. So the longer the war goes on, the more brigades like the Azov Brigade need their things. So need these replacement weapon systems. So again, this is something where I, since 2022, have not really seen any evidence of Azov adhering to its far-right ideology. Again, they seem to have, through attrition and through cultural shifts of being brought into the Ukrainian military, seem to have rehabilitated their image. Or just change their ideology, right? So I think that is an overall positive, but in less positive news, you can look at the front lines here and you can see there's actually a number of Russian advances near Novoprokopsk. You could see here, again, not a huge advance, but it does represent Russian forces entering this critical kind of lightly urbanized area, making some advances here, as well as trying to actually encircle this empty field outside of Umansky. I think this is likely might be the Russian strategy. Again, they have a real emphasis on seizing territory, total square kilometers, and Ukraine is really focused on defending where it counts. So I think you're going to see Ukraine withdraw and try to hold Novolesivka Persha and Novopokrovsky. but that remains to be seen. You also have some Russian advances near Staromayorsk. This is something where, again, I don't expect to see Ukrainian forces really fight tooth and nail to hold this kind of territory. Now that the counteroffensive has culminated, the Ukrainian forces likely are not going to really view holding this territory. These villages aren't the gateway to anywhere significant now. When the counteroffensive was in full swing, this was seen as kind of a potential route for Ukrainian forces to piecemeal into Russian-held territory, but it just doesn't seem to be happening that way. And so there's no reason to fight tooth and nail to hold these kind of destroyed territories. And Russian forces are listed as having captured Ivanivsky, right? And I think this is interesting. Again, you can see that this has been part of this kind of attritional strategy for some time. And now Russian forces are assessed as being completely in control of the village, which is significant only in so much as it rolls back one of the villages that formed kind of a high watermark of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. You can see back here into May, this has been just a steady Russian advance into these pieces of territory that have been that were liberated by Ukraine during the counteroffensive. But when you look at the control map, you see something interesting. One, the Russian Ministry of Defense claiming the occupation of Artemivka in Luhansk and Timkivka in Kharkiv. You could see, you got to zoom in a little bit to see it. Now you might be like, oh, look, it's Ivanivka, different Ivanivka. Now you can see this Yadhine Ivanivka, not Ivanevsky. But you can see this is a village that seems very small, some almost unmarked. And I think the takeaway here is, again, that Russia's out here saying, hey, we're still taking these villages. They want to be able to put more feathers in their cap, so to speak. And even if these villages are extremely small. What's interesting, though, is 5 hours ago, the actual spokesperson for the Ukrainian forces defending Ivanivsky said that the Russians don't control the village. The Russians do not yet have total control. Which is really unusual to see this kind of pushback on an issue like Ivanivsky. So usually when Russians claim control, Russia seems to have become somewhat more disciplined over the last couple of months about claiming control of villages it actually controls. But I find this interesting that, again, there's still some controversy. And we know that in this fight, there's a lot of attacks and counterattacks, but it's embarrassing for Russia, who doesn't have a problem spinning out nonsense propaganda. But Russia doesn't want to look like it's uncredible or that it can't actually seize territory. So I think is it premature? I don't think so. Generally, deep state is accurate and believable. Now, guys, if you want to see some of the fighting, both in the north and in the east, we're going to be taking a look at that footage today on combatvetnews.com. If you want to support the channel, you guys know YouTube routinely demonetizes my content. Sponsors really have dried up. You might notice this month we had 0 sponsors. And that means I rely on you guys to keep me able to do this every single day. So twice a week, I drop uncensored combat footage analysis. It's usually within 7 days old. Oftentimes, it's less than 24 hours old when we look at it. And it's available only for members. So if you want to support the channel, you can absolutely check out. Any one of these tiers is going to get you access. But if you want the shout outs at the end of the videos and other exclusive benefits that are coming soon, the lieutenant or even the colonel tier are for you. And again, I appreciate you guys, all of you guys that are members, and especially the lieutenant and colonel folks. I could not do this without you guys. Sincerely, I appreciate it. Okay. Now, there's more stories. One is interesting because the new Russian defense minister, the Russian spin machine doesn't just target overseas countries. It targets its own people. And one of the spin machine sort of talking points, they're saying that the new Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov, actually met with Russian mill bloggers and military commentators yesterday. And he suggested that the Kremlin right, is trying to use Belousov's replacement as saying, listen, mill bloggers, you were right. Your criticisms were heard, and we ousted Shoigu, and we've replaced him with this economist, right? And they're trying to potentially getting good with these mill bloggers because so few Russians trust Kremlin mainstream news outlets that they rely on mill bloggers for true, accurate information. And some of the mill bloggers do appear to be reporting at least uncomfortable truths about the war in Ukraine. And for Russia, that's a tremendous risk. Popular sentiment turning against the war, even though they're not a democracy, they still need to have a certain basic level of concordance with the way the government is being run. And when you're losing 5,000 military-age men a day, you end up in a month, you end up in a situation where the public may very well turn against you. So Belousov met with these mill bloggers to discuss the fact that, again, Belousov, he invited some of the mill bloggers, but the most critical mill bloggers were not even given an invite. This is pretty common even in the United States, where when media outlets are sufficiently critical of the administration, they suddenly don't get invites to the White House. They don't get invites to exclusive events. This is pretty common. The administration won't make their people available for interviews. And so this sort of ensures that coverage is sufficiently favorable, right? It incentivizes favorable coverage in order to preserve the access that being a pro-Kremlin mill blogger in this case gets you, right? But the Kremlin is trying to portray Belousov as more attentive to the mill bloggers' criticisms, but at the end of the day, Putin seems happy and content with the direction the war is currently taking. So I think there's unlikely to be a major shift in command or tactics, right? Even though these are high casualty tactics. Putin has said, we're going to keep doing it. We're going to keep going the way we go. And we're going to attrition out the Ukrainians, which is really, really interesting. And I think the mill bloggers who often criticize, whose criticisms often are focused on the mistreatment or abuse of individual soldiers or lower level tactical formations, I think they're not going to be happy with Belousov. But again, Putin is out here trying to buy more time, trying to buy some goodwill, and is much more about a performance than it is about really reforming the military. Belousov is a lot of things. He's an economist, and when you have an economist run the military, casualties are just an acceptable form of attrition. There's more. We're not done yet, guys. There's still one more story that I thought was crazy. Speaking of mill bloggers, the United States and Poland have announced a new Ukraine communications group. Now, pardon my skepticism, but the U.S. and Poland jointly launched a Ukraine communications group based in Warsaw that will support Ukraine against Russia's aggression in the information space. Now, if you're a subscriber to this channel, you know that Russia has really ramped up its information operations, trying to influence across the spectrum of information, from internet to corrupting politicians, to promoting Russian talking points, to producing like slick documentaries criticizing Western leaders. The Russian information operation is large and sophisticated, and it is just as important to Putin as success on the actual battlefield. Okay, people don't understand this, but obviously State Department does. Representatives from the participating countries will collaborate in person to support Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity through collaborative efforts to counter disinformation and support fact-based reporting. This is to expose, call out Kremlin nonsense. Now, don't get me wrong. The Ukrainians also we've talked about this on this channel a lot, but I'm going to emphasize this point because it's really important. In the West and in other democracies, the state, generally, the risk-reward ratio to saying totally untrue things is just too skewed. So, for example, if the U.S. was to come out and say Ukraine actually is on the offensive and they are liberating villages as we speak. Well, in a democracy, there's a lot of sources of information. And you'd say, well, no other source of information other than state-backed entities is saying this. I think the state is wrong, and now I can't trust anything the state says, right? And so, and that ends up giving credence to even less accurate reporting. So in the West, what information operations consist of, or public diplomacy or propaganda, they're sort of all the same thing, is you say true things and you emphasize the true narrative that favors your entity. For example, pro-Ukrainian sources emphasize now the high casualty rate that Russia is taking, and they de-emphasize the fact that Russia is systematically gaining territory, right? And during the counteroffensive, it was reversed. The casualties were sort of not mentioned as much, but the Ukrainian territorial progress was emphasized a lot more. So those were true things. But the Kremlin just says shit that's not true. Like either factually false things. For example, like Zelensky doesn't have a legitimate claim to power. Why would Russia even weigh in when the Ukrainian parliament says he does? The Ukrainian Supreme Court says he does. The Ukrainian Constitution makes clear that he's able to continue in his role, because of the martial law, a constitutionally delineated process. So that's the kind of straight up lies that the Kremlin tells. So it's important to counteract this. But there's a big but, right? Like an influencer on Instagram, there's a huge but here. The United States and the State Department have some of the worst public diplomacy on God's earth. Truly, truly. They have some of the comically low engagement, comically under-equipped to handle this, right? Like, I mean, if you look at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, this is the U.S.-backed news channel. This is meant to provide fake or real news in countries awash in fake news, right? And you can see that their views are absolute garbage. Like, you can see that other than these kind of salacious combat footage videos, which have about an average number of views for my channel, you can see here that stories about the Ukrainian floods. I mean, look, it's hard to find a video, a report that has more than 20,000 views. Here's one 2 weeks ago on Check Ammo Initiative, right? But the average report gets, look at it, as little as 2,000 views. So they're just reaching an absolutely unbelievably tiny audience. And this is typical. Go on the State Department Twitter accounts or the U.S. Embassy for Ukraine, and you can see that they have very low engagement, extremely just boring, workshop to death content, right? And it's not an act like it's because the U.S. government sucks at communications because they're always decades behind. Right? Here's the Ukrainian embassy in the U.S. And you could see that they get, sorry. I was like, wow, this is actually a pretty good engagement. And then I realized, no, they had retweeted United 24, retweeting Zelensky. Again, these are entities that actually know how to drive engagement, right? Their own tweets get, what's that, like a tenth of a Zelensky tweet? Just really, really paltry stuff here. And you can see here's like a commemoration of the 10 years of Russian occupation, and you can see it's got almost no engagement, right? When they tweet, almost nobody. Look at this, 1 comment, 2 likes. Just when they tweet, there's just comically little engagement. So I wouldn't sit there and be realistic that the Ukraine Communications Group is going to have any chance at pushing back against Kremlin propaganda, right? And that's one of the reasons I do this every day, is because I'm out here. I'm not, I'm not somebody who pretends like things aren't real. Like, I give you guys the realist assessment I can of the situation, right? Do I want Ukraine to win? Sure. Does that mean I have to, that I can't report the bad things that happen to them? No. And in fact, I consider what I do to be essential. Because look, if I had pretended that things are going great, then would you guys have known to write your congressman and say, listen, Ukraine needs this aid. Ukraine is not, things are not going great. Ukraine needs assistance. And when you commit yourself to a propaganda message, you can't do those things. So I don't. But I do try my best to call out Kremlin nonsense on this channel. And boy, I would love to get some of that State Department money. You guys know. But, even if they offered it to me, I was a Fed long enough. I wouldn't touch that money with a 10-foot pole. It comes with so many strings. It would mean some political appointee would have to review all my videos or some other nonsense. They would be insufferable. Never in a million years. Again, that's why Combat Vet News, that's enough for me, right? Anyway, thank you guys so much. Thank you to the Colonel tier members of Combat Vet News. I answer only to you, Colonel, Lieutenant, and Specialist tier members of Combat Vet News, right? Not some RT shill, not some State Department shill. I'm here for the people, and I appreciate you. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. See ya.